Ticks, despite their size, are probably one of the most dangerous animals you're likely to encounter in a woodland environment like this. Now, if you spend any length of time outdoors, especially as much as somebody like me, and you happen to live in regions like the UK or Europe or the United States, particularly on the East Coast, then ticks are a real thing that you have to pay a lot of attention to, because they're incredibly hazardous and they don't get anywhere near as enough attention as a lot of people should be giving them. So what is a tick? Well, basically a tick is a very small arachnid. It's a parasitic arachnid, so it's related to spiders, but it's parasitic in nature. It feeds on the blood of its hosts. Now it does this, contrary to popular belief, not by flying or jumping or anything like that. Instead, what it will do is it will simply climb up onto a piece of grass or a fern or something like that, and it will sit and wait with its hooked legs, waiting for its prey to come past, usually some sort of hairy mammal of some description. So deer, sheep, rabbits, mice, humans, dogs, anything like that, it'll latch on. And once it latches onto the hair or the clothing of the person that's walked past or the animal that's walked past, it will slowly make its way either up the clothing or into the hair of the animal, looking for a place to feed. And it will tend to do this round about easy access places where they're not going to get scratched off. So in animals it'll be underneath the belly, round about the ears, round about the eyes, places like that. On humans it tends to be that they will climb up your trouser legs and they'll go to the first piece of soft skin that they encounter, which is usually round about the waistline or just above the belt. But they'll also go on legs, behind the legs, in your hair, pretty much anywhere that they can latch on. Now the problem with ticks isn't the fact that they are parasitic in nature and they bite. There's lots of animals that do that. What makes them especially dangerous is that they harbour and can pass on a number of diseases, including Lyme's disease, which is one of the most hazardous diseases or infections that you can get while being in the outdoors. It's very hard to treat. The treatment for it is generally just in the form of antibiotics. Lyme disease can have very long lasting and significant health repercussions if a person contracts it. Dogs can also catch Lyme disease, by the way. If left untreated, I believe it can even be fatal in some cases. There are several other diseases that they also pass on, encephalitis, and I believe there's even a disease in North America which to me sounds like a fate worse than death, where it actually can pass on an infection that causes you to become allergic to red meat, effectively turning you into a vegetarian, which, you know, what a horrendous thing to have to happen to you. I believe that comes from a tick called the Lone Star tick, which is prevalent in the United States. Now, for whatever reason, ticks have become more abundant. This might be due to climate change or some other factors. Whatever the reason, there's certainly a lot more of them. For me, I've come to the realisation that it's impossible for me to avoid ticks entirely. There's just far too many ticks in the environment that I spend a lot of my time in. So what do I do to try and avoid being bitten by ticks? Well, first of all, the first step is just awareness. Be aware of the fact that there are ticks in the environment that you're going to be in. And it doesn't have to be in remote woodlands. You can get ticks anywhere where there are mice or sheep or deer or anything like this. You could have them in your own backyard. But for me, generally, it's a woodland environment. So it's about being aware of your environment and your surroundings. Now, ticks, contrary to popular belief, are a risk all year round. There certainly appears to be more of them in the spring and summertime, and they go slightly more dormant in the colder winter periods, but they are absolutely still active during the winter time. There's less vegetation in the winter, which makes it easier to navigate through a woodland environment without coming in contact with a tick. And obviously in the summertime, like just now, there's a lot more grass and ferns and things like that for the ticks to harbour. That being said, you have to be aware of the fact that they are all year rounds, and all of the preventative measures that you take in the summer you should also take in the winter. So just expelling a couple of the myths, I've already covered some of them before. Ticks don't fly, they don't jump, they don't tend to be up in trees. Usually they're quite low down to the ground, and that's where they latch onto their prey along animal trails and things like that. Now, as I've said, ticks don't all die off in the winter. You can't drown a tick by holding the bitten part of your body underwater or something for a period of time. That would take a very long time. I believe ticks have even been found on penguins in Antarctica. So You know, if they can handle that, they're going to handle your kitchen sink. There are no magic formulas or creams that guarantee that ticks won't latch onto you. They're always going to have a go to you, have a go at latching onto you no matter what. There are things you can apply, which I'll cover, that can help prevent this or protect you against this, but ultimately you have to just be aware of the fact that they're always around and you have to always check yourself. However, ticks on your dog or something like that, if they've went undetected, they will feed on the dog continuously until they swell up into like a big gross looking animal, and then they will drop off. And you know, if they drop off in your backyard where you've got a lot of vegetation, it's not going to immediately die, and it's going to be out there in the outdoor environment, or you're passing it on to, you know, your neighbours or the park where you walk the dog or something like that. I would also say, just in my experience, when it comes to doing camping trips and things like that, make sure that you're treating your own body and your own clothing as almost a contaminated subject, especially when you're about to go to sleep. Because if you are getting ready to spend the night in a hammock, for example, and you've still got your t-shirt on and some of your clothing and things like that, and all you do is you take, you know, your trousers off and your jacket off, and then you immediately jump into your sleeping bag. If you haven't done a proper check of yourself and you're carrying the tick into your sleeping bag, you're then going to spend the next 8 or 9 hours of staying in a nice warm still environment, giving that tick plenty of time to feed off of you, and you're almost certainly not going to detect it in doing so. And like we've said before, the longer a tick is lashed onto you, the more dangerous, the more hazardous the tick is likely to be to you. Now, it usually takes a tick a little bit of time from the point of getting onto the hair of the animal or the clothing of the person before it then bites. It doesn't do it immediately. It usually likes to crawl its way up and find a place in order to do it. So that's the best time to detect a tick. Spot it and remove it. You can do this with the help of having lighter clothing, for example. It's a little bit easier to see ticks as they're generally quite dark, and some of them can be incredibly small. Light coloured clothing makes it easier to see any ticks that are on your legs. That's generally where they end up. That's generally where they tend to be first. It's always a good idea just to, every now and again, give yourself a little bit of a check over. What ticks will tend to do is they'll go on your legs because you've brushed through the brush and have attached themselves to your clothing, your trousers. And even if you've sealed up the bottom like I have, they'll slowly make their way up your trousers until they can find a soft piece of skin. Usually sort of just above your belt line is a place where they tend to be. That tends to be where I also seem to get them. Tuck in t-shirts and things to make it harder to get in there, but it's not always easy. Sometimes you can get away with feeling them on your skin or on your hair, but don't rely on this. Also, ticks when they bite are painless. You can't really feel a tick biting you. It's a very clever system that they've developed to be able to latch onto an animal without detection. Now, not all ticks have Lyme disease, and not all tick bites are guaranteed to pass Lyme disease on. The percentage of infected ticks varies from place to place. Lyme disease is actually, the tick picks up the Lyme disease from mice, and then the infected tick passes that on to animals such as humans and dogs that don't have the natural immunity to fend off Lyme disease. So the percentage of what ticks have Lyme disease wise changes based on whereabouts you are in the world. I have heard it said that sort of between 5 and 10% is a general rule of thumb. Now that is quite a lot, however. If you say, for example, on the high end that 10% of ticks have Lyme disease, okay, that's 1 in 10. I typically find, you know, at least 10 ticks on me, on my clothing at least, or more, in just one season of being outdoors in the UK. And typically I'll have 2 or 3 bites of ticks latching onto me in a year. Even with all of the measures I take to try and prevent ticks from biting me, I still occasionally get ticks latching onto me. So with those kind of numbers, you can see I wouldn't have to be outdoors for very long before my luck would run out and one of the ticks that bites me would eventually have something like Lyme disease or some other bacteria or disease that it can pass on to me. Now, if a tick does latch onto you and bites you, it will burrow itself in and leave its rear end exposed, and that's how it breathes. Now, the quicker that you can remove the tick, the more likely it is that the tick isn't going to have a chance to pass on any of these hazardous diseases. Exactly how long it takes for a tick with Lyme disease, for example, to pass that infection on to you is slightly disputed online by the looks of it, but it does appear to be somewhere along the lines of 12 to 24 hours. So if you're checking your clothing and your body at least every 2 or 3 hours, then you have a far greater chance of detecting the tick and removing the tick before any harm can be done to you. So your first layer of defence is awareness. Your second layer of defence is the cover of your body, the clothing that you're wearing and the way that you cover it. Like I've said before, light coloured clothing makes it a little bit easier to see ticks and things like that. For a lot of people in the outdoors, such as myself, I don't always want to be seen, so I tend to wear darker neutral colours because I want to be able to see the wildlife and things like that around about me. So that's a common thing. The way that you wear the clothing, the less exposed skin that you have, the better. So if you're wearing a t-shirt, tuck it into your belt. Some people like to tuck the bottoms of their trousers into their socks. I believe a better method of preventing ticks from climbing up your legs is to use something like these. Twisters. It's just a very small bungee, 2 hooks on the end. They use these in the British military. A very efficient way of protecting your legs from ticks, and also tucking your trousers up above your boots so they don't get covered in mud and water and things like that. You can use elastic bands to do the same thing, but these are inexpensive and more efficient. I keep a spare set in my toiletries kit. The next thing I do with clothing is I try to use the same sort of sets of clothing for the outdoors all of the time. So they're dedicated outdoor type clothing, if you will. The advantage of this is that I can treat my clothing, an anti-tick treatment applied directly to the clothing. Now, there's several different brands and formulas you can use to treat your clothing. Some of them are you put into the washing machine and you wash them into the fabric. Other ones you spray onto the clothing. Those are the type that I prefer. Now, the chemical that you're looking for in order to prevent ticks is called permethrin. Permethrin, from what I understand, was an insecticide developed by the US Army, and it impregnates into the clothing and ticks on contact die. So it's a good preventative measure. Now, it's quite difficult to find permethrin in the UK, I find. This is the product I use, and it's one of the very few that contains the ingredient. That said, however, it does actually only contain 0.512%. That, however, is apparently enough to act as a preventative barrier on your clothing against ticks. Now, once you spray it onto your clothing, it will last. It will stay in the clothing for several weeks, even a couple of months, even with some cool washes. Now, it's not recommended that this come in contact with your skin. I wouldn't go breathing it in, and from what I understand, it's particularly dangerous for cats. So if you have pet cats, make sure they're, away from the area that you're using this treatment. The way it basically works, or the way I use it, is I lay out the clothing that I tend to use, including my boots. The way I tend to apply this is I will lay out my clothing, almost all my clothing, apart from my underwear, but t-shirts, jacket, trousers, including my boots, hats, things like that. I will lay them out and spray this all over my clothing, and then allow it to dry. Because it's not the cheapest of stuff, if you're looking to apply this to nets or shelters or tents or anything like that, which I've got one of those bug domes that I sometimes sleep in, and I apply this to that as well. I'll lay that out first on the ground, and then I'll put my clothing on top of it so I'm using as much of the product as possible. I have heard some other people online, including medical experts, talking about DEET as a preventative barrier, or repellent against ticks. From what I understand, DEET isn't quite as effective against ticks as it is against things like mosquitoes and midges, that's what DEET is developed for. It works in a completely different way to the permethrin. In my experience, it doesn't seem to quite make much of a difference. If you are going to use something like a DEET based product to prevent bites from midges and mosquitoes anyway, then something that I will sometimes do is also put a little bit of this on areas like my stomach just above my belt line, which is where I tend to pick up most ticks. Whether that helps or not, I'm not entirely sure. I would imagine if you have some of this on your skin and a tick comes across it, it might try to move on, giving you a little bit more time to detect the tick and remove it before it latches on. So the next stage of tick prevention and removal is, as said before, the continuous inspection of your own body or other people that are with you, especially in the hard to find type areas. Now, inside my toiletries bag, I will carry some tick tweezers. There's lots of different kinds of these. They're very cheap. You want 2 different sizes if you're going to have the type like this. One for the very, very small ticks and one for the slightly larger ticks. Now, when you see the tick latched onto the skin, the way that these work is that you move it across the skin until the tick is between the 2 nip points, and then you twist and then pull up. What you want to do is prevent simply just pulling the tick straight out, because often what happens is you will break the tick in half and the mouth parts of the tick will remain in your skin, and that's really difficult to then dig out. You'll have to get a needle or something and try and pick it out that way, and that will increase the risk of infection. So you want to twist before lifting out the ticks. Especially if you're using something like tweezers, it's quite difficult sometimes to get that twisting action on tweezers, which is why something like this is particularly handy. Never try and burn a tick or drown a tick or put Vaseline on a tick or some other chemical or some other nonsense like that. Forget all that stuff. All you're really doing is allowing the tick to be in your body for longer, which, as we've already discussed, is incredibly hazardous. Or what you're going to do is affect the tick's ability to breathe, and it's going to vomit up whatever it is that's inside of its body into the wound that it's just bit. Prevent doing anything other than simply removing it. Once you've removed the tick, wipe the area down with an antibacterial wipe or an alcohol wipe or something like that, and then monitor the bite. What you're looking for in the bitten area are swelling, red marks, rashes, anything like that. One symptom of Lyme disease is a bullseye shaped type pat around about the bitten area. If you see that, then you have to immediately seek medical attention and tell them that you've been bitten by a tick, and they will give you antibiotics, and also carry out further tests to see if you've been infected with any of the tick-borne diseases. Now, something else you can actually do if you detect a tick on your body and you're concerned about it for whatever reason is you can actually keep the tick in a small container or something, and there's various places you can go online and get test kits, either home test kits or you actually send the tick away and the tick gets tested in a laboratory somewhere, and that helps them build a picture of ticks in your particular area, but also allows you to see whether the tick was of a particularly high risk, whether it was infected with something or not. Some tick prevention websites will go on about immediately seeking medical attention anytime you're bitten by a tick. For somebody like me personally, like I've said before, I come in contact with ticks so often that if I was to try to go to my doctor every time a tick bit me, I would be there, 3-4 times a year, and that's just a waste of my time and their time. And to be honest, and the one time that I have had a concern about the possibility of a tick-borne infection and speaking to my doctor about it, they didn't seem that knowledgeable about the subject or that concerned about it, to be honest. I think that's probably because they just don't pay it as much attention as I believe they should. Particularly if the doctors are in a big city and you happen to be out in the countryside or something, and that's where you've picked up the tick bite. Next, when you get home, what you want to do, if you have the ability to do so, is take all of the clothing that you've had on from the outdoors. I have heard people say that putting clothing in a tumble dryer is a good way of removing any ticks that are still on your clothing. Me personally, I simply just put them into a pile at my back door, and then that pile of clothing tends to go straight into a wash machine anyway, and then it goes into a tumble dryer or out in a washing line. Ticks can only survive outdoors, so you don't really have to worry about ticks falling off your clothing into your house and, you know, an infestation of your house or anything like that. That isn't the case. Now, one of the reasons I keep these in my toiletries bag is because that's one of the best times that you can do something of a little bit of an intimate search of yourself for ticks. You should always be looking down at yourself and your clothing and your body anyway, but when you go, you know, behind the tree somewhere to do your business, that's a good time for you to have a little bit of an extra inspection of yourself to see if there's anything latched onto you and areas that you can't just glance down. Remember, you can't always feel ticks when they bite. And if you do discover a tick, having these to hand right away is the best course of action.